number one frame is the events of 9/11. In this country, we no longer even say 9/11/2001. We just say 9/11. In other words, the year 2001 has disappeared and has become the ground zero, as the site has become ground zero, the year zero. But historically, if we come back out of 9/11, inadvertently, we always start the narrative from 9/11. But if you start the narrative from 1973 or from 1967 or from 1948, what the Palestinians call Nakba, you have an entirely different story. That is, you open the shot of the camera and you have other things. Not only things that happened before 9/11, but things that have happened after 9/11. As I said in my opening remarks, the fact that 3,000 innocent Americans were killed on events of 9/11 is a horrid criminal act that must be called that and specifically identified. But equally important is the fact that this thing called Western, if United States is part of Western civilization, then the illegal, immoral invasion of Iraq is also part of that context, is it not? And if we pull, and how many people were killed after the US-led invasion of Iraq? 656,000. So one act cannot be singularly plucked out of historical context with concentration on that single fact, horrific, etc., and then the rest of history prior to 9/11 and after 9/11 forgotten. But more importantly is the question of, when we say is Islam is not just Islam of the last 10 years. Islam is 1,400 years, right? Is Islam a threat to Western civilization? As Mr. Ibrahim said, this is a sort of moral, philosophical, epistemological question. What Mr. Ibrahim described as the legal aspect, which is he's absolutely correct, is one important but one aspect of a much larger phenomenon. In the development of Islamic intellectual history, the development of the juridical aspect of Islamic history is one extremely important, as he said, but one aspect. Simultaneous with the development of Islamic law, you have the development of Islamic mysticism, exactly at the same time, heavily influenced by Christian asceticism and by Buddhism. Equally important in the course of the development, early Islamic history, is the development of Islamic philosophy. Islamic philosophy developed in dialogue with Greek philosophy. Now, neither philosophy nor mysticism are these amorphous intellectual things that have no political ground. If the mosque is the ground and the base and the site of the development of Islamic law, the court is the site of Islamic philosophy, and Zawiya, or the establishment for Sufi orders, are the site of the development of mysticism. And mysticism has a profound political dimension. So it is like the famous group that happens in Masnavi. There is an elephant in a dark room and a number of blind people just touching different parts of it, trying to figure out what that thing is. Depends where you touch it. Islam as a multifaceted phenomenon is the same thing. If you only concentrate on the juridical aspect of it, and on the juridical aspect, Mr. Ibrahim mentioned Quran, which is an important factor of it, and Sunnah, what the Prophet has said and done, but also two other important aspects of Islamic law is called ijma, or legal consensus, and qiyas, or legal analogy. The combination of these four factors, the Quran, the Hadith, the ijma, and the qiyas, provides a varieties of modes of interpretation that has now been consolidated into four schools of Islamic law, but they are not exhaustive. That is, historically there have been more than four schools of law. The schools of law used to be divided according to the city in which people believed in. It was later that they were codified as schools of law. But if you look at the Islamic history of the last 1,400 years, even the so-called even the juridical aspect, the philosophical aspect, and the mystical aspect, still it doesn't exhaust. If you walk in the streets of Baghdad in the year 1000, not everybody is divided into either a mystic or a philosopher or a jurist. You have the simultaneous development of literary humanism, adab, that has absolutely nothing to do with any religion. The formulation of literary humanism, which is based on literature, on Arabic as a literary phenomenon, has nothing to do with the Quran. one of the most troubling aspect is that something like 9/11 happens, you go to one aspect of Islamic law called jihad, link it to the Quran. Well, yeah, it makes sense. The Quran and the jihad and 9/11 kind of puts it is a nice narrative. But then, as I said, open the camera. Why do you open the camera? Not to confuse, but to contextualize. Contextualization in every aspect helps you to understand the phenomenon more accurately. Not to exonerate, but contextualize. No contextualization exonerates a criminal act like 9/11. And no contextualization exonerates the US-led invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, which is illegal and immoral. And hundreds of thousands of people have been killed because of that. And so far as Christianity being the religion of peace, yes, it has been. But from the very origin of this country, there is a difference between the Christianity of Bartolomeo de las Casas and the Christianity of Sepulveda. Read Bartolomeo de las Casas' account of the Indian massacre. He is the voice of Christian conscience. But read Sepulveda, who totally exonerated and condoned the massacre of Indians. Correct? So the complication of history enables us as ordinary citizens to understand, not to exonerate, not to excuse, not to accept criminal acts, but to understand the context within which events happen. And the events of, if you begin with the ground zero and year zero of 9/11, yes, it's a criminal act and it has to be condemned. If you open it into history of colonialism, imperialism, and the unjust, enduringly unjust predicament of Palestinian people in Palestine, then none of this, again, makes violence acceptable. None of this makes any criminal act acceptable. But the difference between, say, events of July of 2003 in UK with Mayor Livingston and events of 9/11 is that the British treated a terrorist act as a criminal act, not as a political act, not as an ideological act, not asking question what is wrong with Islam, not turning being a Muslim in the presidential election of 2004 into a four-letter word. No, it was a criminal act, and they went after the criminals and did whatever they did. So if President-elect Obama, by his notion that we have to come out of Iraq and go back to Afghanistan, means a criminal act has been perpetrated against the United States, we're going to, after those who perpetrated, I have no problems with that. But if it means changing the theater of operation from Iraq to Afghanistan for yet another militaristic adventure, then that's a different story.
Yes.
Excuse me. Okay, thank you, Dr. Dabashi. I'm going to keep my remarks essentially in response to a lot of what he said, a lot of which is plausible and much of which I agree with. First, I'd like to point out that, as he said about, we tend to think of the current conflict beginning with 9/11, and that there is, in fact, a historical continuum that one should actually look to, such as the Nakba, such as the creation of Israel. But then that leads to the question, where does one stop? Where do we stop looking at history, and where do we actually start looking at the now? Now, I'm actually saying the opposite. If we continue looking at history all the way back and back and back, what's going to come out evident is that Islam began as an aggressive expansionist religion. Let's not forget that for whatever logic that Israel can come up with for taking that land, let's not forget that that land was taken by force, by violent force, from the Christian Byzantine Empire for Muslims. So, in other words, where does the historical argument stop? Much of the land, I'm a Coptic Egyptian. The Copts are the original inhabitants of Egypt who were Christian. To me, in many ways, to say the Palestinians, they have a very great right to Israel and to that land, fine. But then is it not similar to me saying, well, I'm a Coptic Christian, my people were in Egypt 1400 years before Islam, therefore I expect all the Muslims to get out. Now, a lot of people would laugh at that and tell me that's not very realistic. So the question is, where do we draw that line? Or how about every single person living in the United States of America, unless you're not a Native American, you should also ship out. So where does it end, in other words? That's just one thing to keep in mind, and also with that to keep in mind that lots of the aggression began, again, as I said, with the Islamic conquests. Every single country, except for those countries on the periphery of the Islamic world, such as Indonesia, and maybe Somalia, were taken by force and conquest. So I've always found it very difficult to try to, concede to the Islamic world land thinking that it's rightfully theirs when at